So this Founder Friday, I want to talk about how to get a job at a startup. This one's not strictly speaking for entrepreneurs, but it is a question that I get a lot. It's something someone sent me in response to the last Founder Friday, in which I asked you guys to submit your questions to founderfriday@onemonth.com. So how do you get a job at a startup? I spoke at a panel about this recently at NYU, which is where I went to school. And I studied finance and philosophy in school, which has very little to do with entrepreneurship and running a startup. And when I was in that room, I was kind of, first of all, I remembered what it was like being a student in school. And I saw all these faces of people who were, curious about, they wanted to get a job at a startup. They wanted to work at a company like 1 Month or Foursquare or in Twitter or a few of the other people who were on the panel there. And the problem with getting a job at a startup is it's kind of a black box. You don't really know what's going on inside of a startup. It's not like a traditional organization where it's clear what the departments are and what the roles are, and they have all of the jobs on their website. Startups are usually not well run enough for it to be very clear what jobs they're hiring for or even what they need. The startup jobs aren't really like most company jobs. And startup skills aren't like university skills. It's not like you can match up a degree with a job. Startups don't usually need, someone doing, finance, for example. In startups, the roles are a lot more ambiguous and amorphous, and they don't align necessarily with traditional roles at companies. And so, you don't really know even what to train yourself for. Jobs at startups aren't really role-based, they're skill-based. And so if you want to work at a startup, they're going to be looking for a certain set of skills. And you need to know what skills to have based on what problems the startup has and based on what jobs they're hiring for. But that gets to kind of the second core problem of getting a job at a startup is a lot of them don't know what roles they're hiring for. And they may not have the jobs available on their website. Partly that's because most startups don't have anyone in charge of HR, at least not until they hit a certain size, maybe 10 or 20 people. If you really want to work at an early stage startup, it's knowing someone there and knowing one of the co-founders or knowing someone who really needs basically some help and some support that's going to get you the job. And they may not realize they want to hire a person to do something until they meet someone who they're like, wow, you'd be perfect for this thing. I suspect this is true for big companies as well. There's some stat out there that says 90% of jobs are hired through a second degree connection, just like a friend of a friend, and not through a traditional job application process, because the job application process can be time consuming. Most startups don't have the resources to deal with that. Okay, so so working at a startup is kind of like a black box. So how do you deal with this? If you know you want to work at a startup, and I think that's always, something to ask yourself about, why do you want to work at a startup? Well, because it's cool, and you get a lot of flexibility, and it's going to be a totally different environment, maybe more fun, maybe you'll be around people that more align with your values. You're probably not going to get rich as an entry-level person at a startup. It's possible, but it's unlikely. So monetarily, working at a startup, not the best bet. But let's save that for a different topic. I think the biggest reason to want to work at a startup is that you can gain experience and gain responsibility very quickly based on your level of performance. If you do a good job, you can take on essentially almost the sky's the limit based on what they trust you to do. It's also going to be a lot more frustrating than it might be at a regular company because you might not have the resources you need, or there might not be a process already in place to do something, or maybe there's a process in place, but it sucks. So getting into the core of what I want to talk about, how do you get a job at a startup? Well, I think the first bit of advice I would give you is to specialize in one or two core areas of expertise and interest. And what I mean by that is there are a few skills that startups are looking for, or tend to be looking for. And if you can identify some of those skills, there are some that you can learn fairly quickly. I mean, the body of knowledge on some of these things is not that big because the areas are generally new. And I'm talking areas like UX and UI, customer development, growth hacking, onboarding, project management, product management. I mean, okay, some of there's a lot around, but it's not like there's a degree in project management. Is there a degree in project management? You could study it at DeVry. So I don't know, not really. So what are some of the things that you can learn? Well, I have a post that I did on our blog on the Founder Friday before called Resources for the Full Stack Entrepreneur. And I list 20 skills that I think are useful for full stack entrepreneurs. I think a lot of those skills are going to be useful for you if you're trying to get a job at a startup. The first two are leadership, strategy, management, maybe not so useful for an entry-level role, but certainly sales, project management, marketing, PR, product management, customer development, fundraising, accounting, front-end, back-end code, communication, data analytics, customer service, design. A few of those you can get good at really quickly, like I mentioned. There's a really good post by Mark Andreessen. Actually, it's a 6-part series on careers and choosing a career. And in, I think, the second one of that, although it might be the third, because I think he starts them at 0, which is kind of nerdy. In programming, a lot of arrays start at 0. It's called zero indexing. So in the third post, he talks about how there's 2 options in a career. And I think he quotes Scott Adams, who's the creator of Dilbert, on this. So maybe it's actually Scott Adams. You have 2 options. You can try to become the best at one thing, or like top at one particular thing, which is really hard, near impossible for most people. Like think about, playing in the NBA or making like a platinum album. Very few people will ever do it. Okay, so, recommendation, don't try. Although if you want to, try that stuff, totally your thing. Go for it. But option number 2 is become very good, like let's say top 25% at 2 or more things, right? It's certainly easy to become very good at something, top 25%. Everyone has at least a few areas in which they could be in the top 25% with some effort, and probably a good amount of effort. But the secret to this is if you're top 25% in 2 things, then across those 2 areas, you actually start to enter an area where there's very, very few people out there who are in the top 25% of both of those things. And so already you've rocketed yourself past most people. Now the question is, what do you want to become top 25% in? That's where I'd say go take a look at some of those skills that I mentioned before. Below, I have a few more. So once you've decided what those things are and what interests you, and to be honest, if you've never done any of them, it's kind of hard to know. You kind of just have to follow your gut and stick with it, and not, get afraid and not like start over after going through the entire process. A lot of this stuff is just sort of sticking with it and seeing where it takes you. But once you've done that, I would say go out and read the top 2 or 3 books on that skill and summarize them like into a 1-pager, or try to synthesize all of those things. Just reading one book on something and like parroting it back, it's kind of like, plagiarism. Not really, but you only have one view on something. But if you read the top 2 or 3 books, you have different perspectives, and also start to read some of the biggest blogs about that. In that other post that I mentioned about the full stack entrepreneur, I include a lot of the blogs and resources that you can check out. You can become fairly knowledgeable in some of these bodies of knowledge very quickly. So the second thing, rocking the interview with a startup. Every startup has a problem, and that's something important to recognize, is that startups have problems in ways that big companies do not have problems. Big companies hire, to kind of meet additional workloads, right? They know what the process is, and they know that they don't have enough people to fulfill that process, and so they hire more people. At a startup, they have a problem, and they're trying to hire someone to solve that problem. And it's your job to become more intimately connected with the problem and the ways of solving that problem than the person that is interviewing you. And that should be fairly easy because, if the person interviewing you knew about the problem and knew how to solve it, they wouldn't be interviewing you and trying to hire someone to do it. Generally speaking, that's true, right? There are definitely exceptions. But in order to get the job, you have to convince the person interviewing you that you can solve the problem that they have and that you know what they're doing wrong. And a lot of times that means educating them on what they're doing wrong. So an example of this might be, you decide you want to learn about user experience and user interface design. You walk through the company's onboarding flow, you bring it with you, and you point out what they're fucking up and how you would do it better, right? And yeah, it seems a little direct, right? But you have to stand out, and that's one way that you stand out is by telling them, here's what you guys are doing wrong, and here's how I would fix it. And you have to be very proactive about that. I can guarantee you as a candidate, you're going to stand out if you do the work and the research and present something like that. It's already incredibly valuable, and it puts you leagues beyond other people. So recognizing that every startup has a problem. Also, by the way, recognizing that the skills that you have and decide to develop may not align with what the company you're interviewing for needs. And that's not a bad thing. I mean, don't try to change who you are in order to get the job at the startup. It's a little more of a numbers game. So if the company you're looking to work at doesn't need what you have or what you decide is interesting to you, look somewhere else. The worst thing, and I can tell this all the time, is if someone is a little too willing to change, how they present themselves in order to fit a role that you have. And one of the ways that we actually test for this is by asking someone well, we also have this other role that's available that you didn't apply for, but is that something you'd be interested in? And it sounds a little shitty, but if they say yes, well, that's kind of a red flag because you want someone who's going to say, no, not really. I'm actually specifically interested in this area. And that's because, someone who's too willing to change, they tend to not really know what they want, and they tend to not know what they're best at and what interests them. And a lot of times they don't thrive in, those kind of other things. They're a little too flexible. The final thing I would say, and this is where you can really stand out, and it's kind of meta game for applying to a startup, is you want to flip the tables if possible. And what I mean by that is put yourself in a position or a situation in which other companies and other startups are fighting over you. Now, how do you do this? Well, you do this by positioning yourself as a leader in whatever thing you decide you want to be best in, or whatever multiple areas you decide you want to really learn about. So you can do that by starting to teach about the thing that you're talking about. Starting to teach about it, if you're at a university, doing lectures on user onboarding or UX and UI or design at startups or marketing for startups or growth hacking or, project management, product management for startups, whatever it is. You can start to teach about this at co-working spaces. You can blog online. You can record videos of yourself talking about these things. You don't have to be an expert, right? And a lot of people think that because they haven't been doing something or because they haven't had a ton of experience with an area, that they are not entitled to even speak publicly about something or share their opinion or deliver news or information to other people out there. And that's something I would really ask you to question if that's something you believe. Because there's incredible value to being able to digest something and explain it to total beginners or to people who want to learn something in a way that's intuitive and easy to grasp. When I was first a beginner coder, I had maybe a few months of experience, and all I did was I started talking about my story and which resources I had read that were useful to me and which ones weren't useful. And I did this to help total beginners who, had only been just thinking about this and walk them through the process that I had just gone through myself, so it was fresh in my mind. So I wasn't an expert coder, and in fact, I think if I was an expert programmer, it wouldn't have resonated nearly as well, because people, first of all, they wouldn't have connected with my story as well. Plus, it would have been too easy for me to forget what it was like to not know this stuff and to use language and to assume they had certain knowledge of things that they don't. It's called the curse of knowledge. So go out there and try to make yourself a thought leader. Answer questions on Quora or post about this stuff on forums like Reddit, Hacker News. Put yourself out there. Give talks about this stuff, and very quickly you might find yourself in a situation where people start to see you as knowledgeable about this thing, and you can have many startups start to compete and knock at your door about this. I was astounded when I first started teaching about coding, the number of job offers I got where someone would walk up to me after the class and say, I love what you were teaching about. I would love to pay you to do it for my company. Is that something that you're willing to do? So I think that's the ultimate game move, is flip the tables and start to get those companies to compete over you instead of being one of many applicants applying for these startups. So that is just my quick guide, short, simple. Actually, no, this is probably one of the longer Founder Fridays, but I hope it was useful. And if you have any additional questions, post them in the comments below or email them to me at founderfriday@onemonth.com. And I hope to respond to your question in one of these upcoming Founder Fridays. Thank you.